In the last lesson, we learned how to declare a class, give it properties, and use the default empty initializer to create an instance of the class. Now, what do I mean when I say we used the default empty initializer? All right, so first, let's define what an initializer is. Initializers are called when we initialize a new instance of a type. Pretty straightforward. This is the process of preparing an instance to use. During this process, we can set initial values for our properties, do verification checks to make sure everything we need is available, etc. An initializer is a special method that is called when we create a new instance of a type, or in other words, a class or a structure. Writing an initializer is similar to writing other methods, except we use the keyword init, so that the compiler knows this is an initializer method. Now, going back to the default empty initializer, every class has a default empty initializer. But what if we wanted to initialize our class with some specific data or validity checks? Well, we can override and write our own initializers. So let's go ahead and create a new class to demonstrate this. So I'm going to create a new playground here. I'm going to say blank and next. And then I'm going to put this on the desktop. I'm just going to call this developer class and create. All right, so I'm going to delete this string here, and let's go ahead and create our class. So I'm going to say class developer. All right, so this class could represent you as an iOS developer. So let's give it some properties. What are we going to need? We're going to want a first and last name. So I'm going to say var first name is equal to, and we'll just initialize that to an empty string. Then we'll say var last name is equal to an empty string. And let's add a salary, var salary, and we'll just initialize that to 0. Okay, so this is pretty much where we ended the last lesson, declaring a class, having some properties, setting those properties to kind of some just default values. And we can go and make an instance of this class by saying let dev equal developer and use our default empty initializer. So now we have created an instance of our developer class, but we haven't set any of those properties. So we would have to go through and say dev.firstname is equal to Johnny, dev.lastname is equal to B, and then, set a salary and $1 million, I wish. All right, so that's all well and good, but it's kind of a pain and tedious to have to write all that out every time. Let's make it so that we can initialize it with some data at the point that we initialize it. That sounds better, right? So let's use and create our initializer. Remember, I said we need to use the keyword init. And you see here it says init is Swift initializer declaration, a set of statements that prepares an instance of a class, structure, or enumeration for use. All right, so we press return and we get init with parameters and statements. We're going to start out with a very simple example of init. So I'm not going to provide any parameters. And in fact, all we're going to do is print out this class has been initialized. And I know I spelled that wrong, that's okay. All right, so I'm going to again say let dev equal developer, and we're going to run this. And you can see printed out to the log, this class has been initialized. So we can see that when we initialize, this init method is being called and we printed this out. All right, so that's not super useful. So let's try some other stuff here. What we're going to do is first off, we're going to create an initializer that is going to set these initial values just like you see here. Okay, so I'm going to say first name is equal to an empty string, last name is equal to an empty string, and salary is equal to 0. Okay, so looks like we have some duplicate code here, right? Why do we need this initializer if we have them set here? We don't, so we're going to go ahead and make this just a type. So I'm going to say var first name is of type string, last name is of type string also, and let's do salary of type double, okay? So make sure that these are colons here and not equal signs. All right, so now when we initialize an instance of our class, we're calling init, and we are setting values for our properties here. So now if we say let dev equal developer, now we can say print dev dot salary, and if we run this, then it should print out 0, okay? Now watch what happens if I comment any one of these out. We're going to get an error, and it says that the return from the initializer without initializing all stored properties. So the compiler sees that we have 3 properties here, but our initializer is only taking care of 2 of them. And so we get an error here, okay? So I'm going to uncomment that, and then that error goes away. All right, so that's all well and good, but we were saying that we don't want default values when we initialize, all right? So how do we do that? Well, we're going to create another initializer, and we can have as many initializers as we want or need, all right? So this time when we initialize our object, we are going to pass into it some values that we want to be assigned to our first and last name, okay? So for this initializer, we're just going to do first and last name. So I'm going to say first is of type string. Actually, let me make that first name so that I can show you something. First name and last name, also of type string, okay? So remember, this is very similar to our functions. Just like we've learned, we can have parameters that we can use inside of the method, okay? So we are passing into this function a first name and last name variables, both of type string. And then here inside, we can use those, okay? So when we initialize and pass into it 2 strings, we are going to assign self.firstName equal to first name and self.lastName is equal to last name, all right? So what is this self keyword? This means that we want to access this one right here, okay? So self is referring to the instance of the class. So this first name refers to the class variable first name, and this first name variable refers to the local first name variable that was passed into the init method. And again, we have to make sure that we account for all of our stored properties. So we're going to say salary is equal to 0. Okay, so we're just setting again a default value for the salary. Okay, so now when we initialize our object and we say developer, and then we do open parentheses, you'll see that we now have this constructor available to us. And if we press enter, you'll see that now we have the parameter names, first name and last name. I should say argument names, first name and last name. And you can switch between the placeholders by tab. So tabbing, you can get to different ones. So for the first name, just press enter, or I should say delete. And then you can go ahead and put in a string for the first name. I'm going to say Johnny. Then I'm going to press tab, delete, quotation marks, and B. Okay, so we are initializing this object with our first name and last name automatically in there. So now I can just say print dev.firstName and run this, and we see printed out Johnny. All right, great. All right, now let's create a third initializer that will allow us to set all 3 of our properties just at initialization. So I'm going to say init, and our parameters are going to be first, and this time I'm going to change it up slightly so we don't have to use the self. So I'm going to say first of type string, last of type string, and salary of type double, okay? And so you'll see here, I don't need to use the self this time because we don't need to differentiate between the 2 variables. So I can just say first name is equal to first, last name is equal to last, but here I am going to have to differentiate because our variable names are the same. So I'm going to say self.salary to indicate that I'm setting our class variable equal to the variable value that was passed into the initializer. Is equal to salary. Alrighty, very good. So now let's go ahead and delete this again, and we're going to say developer, open parentheses, and now you'll see that we have 2 constructors available to us. 3 if you count just the empty default initializer, okay? So you can pick which one of these that you want. Let's go with the one that we just created. So first, put in Johnny, last, B, and our salary is $100,000. And down here, we can say print dev.salary. And if we run that, then we see here 100,000. All right, perfect. So this is very common to have multiple constructors. If we look at some of the core UI classes like UI color, for instance, so if we say let color equal UI color, we see all of these different constructors, right? And just to clarify some jargon here, we call it an initializer when it's here inside of the class, but out here when we're using it, then we call it a constructor, okay? So UI color, and we have all of these different initializers. In fact, we can check out the code that makes up a UI color class. If we command and click right here and go to jump to definition, then you can see here that we have a class here. And it's named UI color. We have initializers and variables, and you can kind of start to see how it's similar to what we're doing with our simple classes, and that the Swift library and UI kit is just made up of a whole lot of different classes and structures that we can then use and create instances of. View controller is a class, UI image is a class, and if you want, you can kind of just go and explore the guts of these classes by saying, let me just get this right here, and then command clicking, and you can jump to the definition, and you can learn quite a bit just by kind of browsing through these classes. Just in case you're wondering, this @available means that you have to be using iOS 2.0 or above to use a UI image. These initializers are only available on iOS 8.0 and up, and etc. All right. So that is initializers. We can make our own initializers to set initial properties at initialization, and we can have as many as we need, all right? So I will see you all in the next one where we're gonna keep talking about classes.